Hey guys, it's Toniko Pantoja, and today I'd like to talk about how you can achieve more cinematic language in your storyboard work or your shot compositions for your films, animation projects, story beats, you name it. So how would I define a cinematic language or a cinematic shot? Because that term gets thrown around loosely, especially in the animation industry, where sometimes the notes that you get is make it more cinematic. What the hell does that even mean? And sometimes there's many people who throw that term around and they don't really understand what it means. Like I've worked with directors who, when they mention cinematic shots, they only think about Lawrence of Arabia, epic shots, Dutch angles, pulling the camera far back, and they just label that as cinematic. I personally think it's a lazy way of thinking what a cinematic shot is because there's a lot of great cinema out there that use unorthodox shots or really strange composition and filmmaking. I guess everyone has their own definition of what a cinematic shot is or how to implement cinematic shots in your sequence. So some people think it's just visual aesthetics. It could just be a visual style. But what's the point of having a visual style when you can't really back it up with the intentions behind it, right? A thing that I see recurring in student portfolios or student work is that they do a certain thing and I'll ask them, okay, why are you using the shot? Why are you using the style? And they'll just say something like, oh, it's because it's more cinematic looking, it's professional. And I'll ask them, okay, what makes it more professional or what makes it more cinematic? And they'll just say something like, oh, because I saw this other artist use it. And my biggest recommendation to people who do things that way, I guess it's fine, but I also want you to build more of an intention behind it. Why you're choosing a certain style or an approach and being able to back it up with pretty good reasons. So if I were to talk about how I define cinematic language or cinematic shots, it kind of depends on the project itself, but my usual go-to is it's two things really. It's using visual subtext to sell an idea, whether it's a character emotion or something that's more symbolic and abstract. And that can be done based on the shot angles, what's on the frame, how is the frame utilized, and how are the sets and props and the characters utilized to give off a certain composition. And then the second one is thinking of the camera as a character themselves, and characters feel, they reflect. How do we make the camera feel, or how do we give off a certain feeling or an idea with the camera? And sure, you can argue how deep the shot is, how abstract it is, how cool, stylized, or aesthetically pleasing it is. But for this video, I'm mostly just going to focus on how to build a visual library for yourself and how to build more honesty and intention when it comes to coming up with your own shots, your own cinematic language. So one practice I would recommend doing is a film study, a shot-by-shot film study. So I would choose a film sequence that I like, something that is interesting, something that resonated with me visually, and it's just my favorite sequence. I like everything about it, and maybe there's some great cinematic language in there. Maybe I want to study editing and how things are shot. Maybe there's a vibe, there's an aesthetic that is kind of haunting me. So I would choose a sequence from a movie that I would like to look at. And I would copy each shot in a small frame, thumbnail size, so I'm not really spending so much time on the details of how the shot looks or how the characters look. It's more of me getting the overall composition, the lighting, and the shapes that I see on screen, just the really broad shapes. At first, I'm really just absorbing the visual language and composition. I'm not really thinking too hard about why everything works. I think that's just a good start to just practice getting different compositions, shot choices, and editing ideas. And then when you're doing these studies, I want you to pay attention to the staging. Is there a sense of consistency? How are things shot and how are they framed? How are the props or how is the set used to compose shots? How are the sets arranged in relationship to the characters in the shot? How is light affected? How does light affect the overall composition and how the characters are portrayed? And maybe down the line, you can start thinking about other values more than just white and black, maybe a dark gray or a light gray, but other than that, I'm keeping things simple. Again, these don't have to be classics or high-rated Rotten Tomatoes movies, because there's some movies that don't do well critically, but have great visual storytelling. And then later down the line, as you're doing your studies, figure out what the purpose of the scene is. Like, what is the main storyline of that sequence? What is the overall point? What is the overall emotional journey these characters are facing? What's the overall context or the major plot point? You can even ask yourself questions like, which character are we following or relating to the most? What is their emotional journey in the scene? And what are they trying to achieve in this scene? What do these things tell us about the character? So when you're asking more of the story elements, emotional elements, then I want you to look at your studies and think about how these shots actually match up to whatever is conveyed through the characters. And you're going to notice a lot of subtle and subconscious filmmaking there, and that to me is where cinematic language shines through. You're going to see choices made by a director or a cinematographer, why they chose certain elements to highlight a character's feeling or an emotional plot point, and how the camera or the shot compositions are characters themselves. And how did the filmmaker utilize those shots for those emotional parts in the story, or whatever is conveyed in that scene. And as you do future film studies, you're going to realize that directors have different takes on pretty much the same subject matter. It's really just about seeing how these filmmakers decide to shoot a certain subject matter, and how they utilize shape, composition, and staging for that. The point here is to sort of get different ideas of filmmaking and just getting a bigger library for that in your filmmaking library. I mean, you can think about rules like how a director maintains the staging line, or how certain shots are used, or how certain shots should not be used. I don't really try to think too hard about that, because I think there's some really unconventional or unorthodox filmmaking that's worth exploring and seeing why it works. Okay, so you've done a few film studies and you're getting a bigger scope or a bigger library for your cinematic language. How do you actually apply this to your own sequences, to your own work, your own films, animation projects, storytelling, yada yada? Well, now here's where the saucy bits start. So if you're new to storyboarding, I would highly recommend creating a diorama of your scene where your characters are at before you even start boarding. So what I mean is you can prepare a single drawing that shows the whole set, like a master shot. It shows everything, the characters, where they're placed. You can even just draw a blueprint or a map of your stage. This is kind of where you want to determine where your background elements are, where the props are, where your characters are staged at, because thinking about this stuff is going to bring in some wonderful opportunities for cinematic language. You can use these sets and props for framing devices, creating overall shapes in the composition, or emphasizing an emotional beat. One thing that you might also want to do if you want to keep your staging consistent is to create a 180-degree rule line or staging line, just so that you can choose a side where most of your camera shots are, and just so that you can keep the whole staging consistent throughout the whole sequence. Then from here, I would play around with camera angles and staging, so you don't necessarily have to board right now or create a sequence, but you can experiment with exploring some different shot language. A great hint that I would give you is to think of the camera as a character or a third person in the scene. The camera can be used to evoke feelings and emotions. Emotions of a character, a power dynamic, etc. A level or mid camera of characters make them feel a bit more stabilized. A camera looking down on a character gives that character a feeling of being weak, small, little, submissive. A camera looking up towards a character makes that character look bigger, stronger, dominant, and sometimes intimidating. A camera going closer to a character's face and eyes give a more intimate experience, sometimes making the viewer go into the character's thoughts. We're really close and we can kind of read what they're thinking. A camera going further away can do the opposite, giving no room for intimacy. It can create a sense of vastness. It can also create a sense of just empty space. But it can also be used to create a sense of awkwardness. So like I did a sequence where I had a hard cut to a super wide while the characters are talking, and that was used to create a sense of awkwardness, just to give characters breathing space or to take in some new information. So it really depends on the context and how you decide to use those shots. Big, wide, open shots could be used to elaborate on vast space, how big the whole area feels or how empty it feels. And these are just executions. They're not rule by rule books, because the great thing about cinema is you can really be playful and creative with it. So an example could also be breaking the 180-degree rule intentionally, and that can be used to create a sense of chaos or something that's a little hard to read or track, and maybe that's the overall intention that you want. Having shots where everything is all smushed together, it's really tight, it's really close in, could also build a sense of uncomfort and claustrophobia. There's no real rule of what shots you should be using. I mean, sure, there's a general rule and ideas of what shots are used for certain things and what's conventional or traditional or universal. As long as you have intentions and you're conscious about that and you're making decisions based on that intention, it can work. That's what it means to have honesty with your storyboards. And it's not really just about camera angles and how far or how close the cameras are to the characters or how the characters are staged, but like I said many times before, use the set and the props to come up with interesting shots. So sometimes I use a prop to create a sense of framing devices, or I use a prop on the foreground to sort of emphasize an emotional arc or an emotional moment of a character. And in ways you can actually use the set and the props as characters themselves. So if a character feels intimidated by the world around it, you can make the props feel like they're overwhelming the character, overpowering them, or even trapping them. And this can also lead to subtext. What are you trying to say about this character using the props? Like in this example, I'm just drawing out everyday scenarios like a grocery store or people eating at a restaurant, but I'm using the props to make a character feel trapped or caged or imprisoned, thinking about subliminal messaging in those shots. Because the great thing that a set can do is sort of form an overall composition in the shot. It can actually help instruct the viewer on how to read or look at a picture. There are other things that you might also want to consider when coming up with cinematic shot languages. There's color, there's lighting, depth, and overall negative space to help create those cinematic shots. It's also good to know things like the camera lens or the focal length. Things with a shorter focal length tend to feel a bit more dynamic. It could also feel really dreamlike. It could be surreal, but it's really pushed. It's exaggerated. Whereas something that's much more longer in terms of the camera lens is going to feel a bit more flat. It's going to be a bit more focused. Things are much closer in terms of proportions. Lighting can also sell subtext, and it really depends on what you're trying to go for. There's this one general example that light over a character makes a character feel hopeful, angelic, in the good side. There's a bit of poignancy in the shot. And then there's underlighting, where a character can feel a bit more sinister, a bit more evil. There's like this dark aura that's around them now. There's a sense of ominous mystery to it too. But again, this is just an example of how light can be used. You can actually flip these around and give off a completely different feeling. Or honestly, it could also just be used to create a sense of focal point. Not really anything emotional, but it can also help drive the viewer on where to look. And also utilizing things like negative space. That's a big one. This is something that I learned recently, where even that empty space can help sell a character's emotions. Like if, let's say, a character is looking at one direction, but there's all this space right behind the character, it can also implement that this character is trying to hide something. And when I was watching House of Dragons, there were two characters talking. One was really backed against the wall, and when it cut to the next shot with this character that was trying to understand the other character, that character was like pushed towards where that character was staged, with that other character trying to understand that character's world, trying to get in their space, trying to be a little empathetic. And again, this is why I highly recommend doing film studies. You know, watch shows, watch films, and pay attention to what the characters are going through, what their emotional arc is, and see how those cameras are placed, because sometimes you'll come up or think about shots that are non-conventional, but they also have really clear intentions behind it. And to me, that's what it means to be cinematic. It's not one of those things where I say, okay, this is how you be cinematic, follow these shots, follow these rules, boom, you're cinematic. It doesn't really work that way. The point I'm trying to make with this video is, when it comes to trying to come up with cinematic shots, or even anything in general when it comes to art, is to have some clear, honest intentions behind it. Don't just pull the horizon line up or down, or cut to a wide shot and say, oh, look at this, it's cinematic, or do a Dutch angle and say, look, it's dynamic. I think that's kind of lazy. So yeah, study from other material, start boarding your own sequences, try to be honest, have clear intentions with it. Think about the character's emotional journey in that sequence and see how you can milk that with your shot choices. Anyways, that's all. Bye. Interested in learning hand-drawn animation or learning how to finish an animated shot from beginning to end? Have a look at the store where you'll find the complete Introduction to 2D Animation video course, tutorials, and other resources. Learn classical animation approaches, drawing, lectures, techniques, and other process videos. Visit the store through the link in the description below.